Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a chilly Wednesday morning here in suburban Chicago, February 12th. I thought I would try something new today. It's not precisely new, but a little different than what I often talk about. I mentioned in the first episode of the year, maybe at the end of the last season, that I was thinking about Tom Vassel's advice to someone saying they wanted to start a new show, radio show or whatever. And I said that, he said that they should be original, be different. Because that's what makes you stand out. Do something different than what other people are doing. And already this podcast is a little different because I built in a way to be able to do it without a ton of editing, i.e. the idea is I'm doing it while I'm walking around. So if it sounds weird, you hear cars go by, yeah, that's expected. Fair. But I was thinking, that got me thinking about what is it that I bring to this space that isn't here all that much otherwise. And I think one of the things is my professional experience as a media critic, for lack of a better phrase. And here I use media critic not in the reviewer sense, but in the sense of a scholarly critic, somebody whose job it is, at least in part, to think about things in a bit more complex way and try to get other people to do the same. So from time to time, I think I'm going to try a new thing here that I don't really have a title for yet. So I'm going to do it and then solicit your feedback on the Board Game Geek Guild, number 3269, about what I should call this segment. I have a number of regular segments on the show. We've got Top of the Stack. We've got Shooting from the Hip. We've got Message from the Deep. I guess those are the three. And we have the Board Game Sommelier. Okay, so here's where I'm starting. I have, in the last couple weeks, had a couple opportunities to play Brass Birmingham. Brass Lancashire is a favorite of mine already. And so I've got a little bit of sort of a reminder of the taste of that game. That's Tentpole 1 or Thought 1 that shapes this conversation. 2, a new game came out recently called Crystal Palace, which I haven't had a chance to play yet. It does sound like it is right up my alley. It sounds very Brass-like. It sounds pretty interesting. I'm not convinced that I want to pull the trigger on it yet. I'm being a bit more hesitant this year. I do have a little bit of money at Miniature Market that I could use left over, but I'm holding off probably till I get to play it from somebody else. So that's number 2, Crystal Palace is out. Number 3 has to do with the fact that I was just reading about the Crystal Palace in some of my scholarly work, and I was reflecting on the fact that the Crystal Palace, which I believe was 1851, was the World's Fair 1851 in London, included a delegation of people from France who were there to meet with British advocates for the International Workers' Union. The idea being that the workers of the world should unite and talk together about how things go. So I was thinking about that in the context of particularly Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire. So if you haven't played these games, they are economic simulations about working in England, being an entrepreneur in England in the 18th and 19th centuries, so the 1700s and the 1800s. Particularly at first during the canal era, when coal was moved by canal and goods were moved by canal, and then later in the rail era when railroads were built and then goods and coal were moved by rail. In both games, you play a factory owner. You're building coal mines, you're building textile factories, you're building shipyards in Lancashire, and in Birmingham you're also building manufactured goods, pottery, and beer breweries. The general flow of the game is that you build these things and then you sell the goods that are in them, and then those score you points, which I guess represent reputation or victory in some way. And then you can build more advanced tiles as the game goes along. You use development actions to get rid of some of your lower scoring tiles, and then you use the advanced building actions to get the higher scoring tiles out on the board. So there's a push-pull in which you're trying to use up your own resources so that you score points from your buildings and your different production areas being maximized. And you are trying to advance technology so you can get more efficient, more high-quality goods and production facilities so that you can make more money and presumably more points. It's a pretty standard... I mean, it's really fun, and it's not like any other Euro I've played in terms of the way that it functions, but in terms of how... That's what I'm looking for. In terms of how economic games work, it's pretty standard for what you'd expect an economic game to be about. Advancing technology, making money, and so on. So the way that I was thinking about this, particularly in the context of the bit I told you about the International Workers Union, has to do with maps. So there's a really interesting book called How to Lie with Maps, which I would recommend because it's very accessible. It's a little old now, so probably in the context of digital maps, things are a little different. But the writer, Marc Monmonier, reminds us of something we've known for a long time, which is that a map is about lying. Because every time you make a map, you must inherently leave out things. That a map that includes everything would be the size of the world. It would be so detailed it would be useless. But what you need is a map that's smaller, that leaves out some things for the purpose of making it easier to understand other things. It's inherently what you're doing in a map. When you make a game, you're doing the same thing. The level of detail that the game includes creates the play space that allows you to enjoy it, but it does so by leaving out significant gaps, significant details in the thing that it's simulating. So for instance, when you play Ticket to Ride, you win by getting points by building these rail lines, but the game doesn't have you deal with money. It doesn't have you deal with the economics of, say, an 18XX game, which is also a train-themed game, but there the mechanisms that work have to do with what kind of technologies are involved, what kinds of stocks are available, and so on. So in the context of Brass, I was thinking about what is left out. What is it that this simulation ignores? And then we come back to the International Workers Union meeting of the 1850s. So if you know your history of the Industrial Revolution, on the one hand, we have the technological progress narrative that we've told ourselves, that we invented machines make it easier to do things, quality of your life improves because goods become cheaper, right? It used to be, before the Industrial Revolution, the average person had to spend a lot of time making clothes. That clothing yourself was a bother. Clothing made by other people was very expensive. Clothing you made yourself was time consuming. You maybe had to actually weave your own fabric out of cloth that you bought. It was a whole thing. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we start to have manufactured fabrics, and clothing becomes less expensive because it takes less time to make. So from the consumer's perspective, that's really great. The issue is the people running those machines. And this is where the very basic idea of capitalism emerges, right? This idea that if you own the things that are making the goods, you get a bigger slice of the profit pie, which makes sense. You're the one who put up the risk. You put your family's livelihood online by investing the money you had in these machines. If things go bad, you're the one who loses all your money. But as a side corollary to that, the people who operate the machines need to be paid, and the amount they're paid is a direct reduction in the amount you make. right? So that the more you pay your workers, the less money you make, the more your risk feels bad because those workers aren't taking the same risk. Sure, they lose a job, but they could go over to the next factory over. They don't owe a lot of debt. They haven't tied up their savings. Of course, the idea that they have savings at all, that's another conversation to have. If you want a sort of novelistic version of this, I would check out The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It's an interesting book about the plight of the worker in the age of mass production. But I was thinking about what would a game like Brass be? How would it work if part of the goal of the game had to do with negotiating with workers and unions? Right? Because the rise of the union age is about workers, the people who make the machine or make the machines run, realizing that together they have power, they have negotiating power together. That they can, if they can all agree we won't work for a certain wage, they can force the owners to give up a bigger percentage of the profit to the workers, or to give up, say, safety guidelines or vacation time or all of the things that we take for granted as part of the working relationship now, right? They come from hard-fought wins from unions. And that comes from the fact that the workers say, we're not going to work for you unless you give us these concessions, then you give us a bigger share of the profit, however you want to call profit. So what would a game... So my big question, and I guess it's ending as a question, because in all this time explaining the premises of the question to you, I'm now 2 blocks from my house. But I guess the thing that got me thinking about as I played Brass Birmingham is the erasure of those workers, right? That when you play Brass Birmingham or you play Lancashire, you don't think at all about the people in the factories. And when you upgrade those factories, you don't think about the idea that maybe the upgrade and the higher profit comes from the fact that you've now built a machine that's more efficient and cut half your labor force. And what does it do to those people? The game is strictly an economic engine or economic simulator that leaves out the human component of the experience being simulated. And I'm not bringing this up to try to stir shit, pardon my French, to try to say like, oh, this game is bad because it doesn't explore this human cost. But so much of the way that we tell the story of the technological progress of the West is couched in terms of the advantages it creates for the owners of capital. And often we don't tell the story of the people on the bottom, to use a hierarchical phrase, who are the ones actually working in those factories. And the level at which using capital as the prime motive for driving things undermines a way of understanding the world that has to do with all the people in it. So I guess part of what I'm interested in exploring, and not necessarily always from the idea of economics, but is what is it that games leave out, and how can we understand what we're saying as a culture when we leave those things out of the game? When the things we choose to not put in the game, how do we understand what's going on there? So with regard to the Brass games, I'd be interested to know, what would a game that took into account worker morale be? And I think about other games that do this. Through the Ages has a worker morale system where if you aren't putting enough resources into things that make people happy, then people will be unhappy. Anachrony has an element where you have to have the managers make effort to have to have your workers have high morale, or else they start to get upset. The third game I can think of that focuses at least on the idea of worker morale is Euphoria, which is a very dark view of worker morale. It basically says if you keep your workers dumb and drugged, they will be happy. But if they get smart, then they'll leave. Which is a dark view of a society, but also a dark view of workers, right? The idea that a smart worker wouldn't want to work in a factory. Only the dumb ones do. I don't think Euphoria meant it that way, but that is one way to read what's going on in that game. So, 2 questions for the Board Game Geek Guild. 1, what do you think? How do you think a mechanism about unions would shape a game like Brass. 2, what will I call what is going to be a semi-recurring segment in which I bring in a little bit of the kind of thinking I do as a scholar and to an observation about a game or a number of games, and we think about the relationship between culture and games a little bit. I'm curious to know what you think. And with that, I'm home, so it's time to go. Please pop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let us know your answers to those questions. Have a great day, and I look forward to next time I see you, because I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.